Hello, everyone. I am Liz England. I might talk a little loud, sorry. I am a designer in Insomniac Games, and today I'm here to talk to you about the worlds of Sunset Overdrive. And so, yeah, do that every time I hit a slide. That'd be really great. So Sunset Overdrive is an open world game, obviously, and I'll go a little bit into it. But this talk is kind of about like the struggle of like the identity of Sunset Overdrive, and specifically, obviously, since this is level design in a day, the level design in Sunset Overdrive and how we created the identity for Sunset Overdrive and how much that affected the level design and required us to make a lot of changes. So if you've played the game, you're probably familiar with Sunset City, right? This is the city we ship with the game. It's a big open world. Yes, thank you. It's a big open world city. It's this really multi-colorful playground, and it's full of this agile traversal, and you're grinding, and you're bouncing, and you're shooting things with guns, and like all good open world games. But this talk is not necessarily about Sunset City, actually. It's about the first two cities we built before we built Sunset City. The first city we built was Greenlight City, which was our first open world prototype. And then the second city we built was actually supposed to be our production city we're supposed to ship with, was called Razor City. And we eventually scrapped that as well in order to create Sunset City. And so today I'm going to talk about what happened with Greenlight City and what happened with Razor City before we ended up with Sunset City, which is the one that you'll be familiar with if you've played the game. Now, just a little bit of background. Just to kind of frame the talk, right? So like Sunset Overdrive is mostly known for one thing, which is its crazy traversal aspect. This is the major gameplay pillar. This is, this super acrobatic traversal that's all about speed and momentum and moving through this world in a non-linear way, and it's really cool. But when we first started making the game, that did not exist at all. We didn't have that at all, and that obviously had a huge impact on our level design. So as traversal became more important in our game, our level design had to change a lot, and so that's kind of the structure of this talk. The other thing I want to point out before I dive into the first city is that while Sunset Overdrive's always had that kind of punk, rock and roll, irreverent attitude, it was still originally pitched as a post-apocalyptic game with zombies. And that has some cultural baggage with it, right? There were a lot of other games like Dead Island and Dead Rising and State of Decay, and there were some, this was a few years ago, so there were some, survival games with zombies that were coming out, and these were influencing us. And so when we first designed the game, we had a few gameplay pillars, and they were reflected by that. And those pillars were, you scavenge for supplies, you craft weapons to help you survive in this apocalypse, and you defend against the mutant hordes. And this is very different from the style of game we ended up with Sunset Overdrive. There's some bits in here that are familiar, but there's a huge change, there's a huge shift that happens. So with that as your frame of reference, let's dive into our first open world, which was Greenlight City. So Greenlight was our first open world prototype, and I mean that literally, because we had never made an open world before, so we were kind of learning as we go. And in Greenlight, it was kind of this really short, flat, kind of gray. I mean, this was all temporary art, right? But like a short and flat, squat city. It reminded us a lot of the Los Angeles urban sprawl, because we are part of the Los Angeles urban sprawl. That's where we are. The player mostly encountered the world from the street level. So this is old pre-production work. And when I say from the street level, what I mean is when you put down the path the player moved through the world, there were none of these paths moving the player up through these buildings, which you'll see much later, right? The player really stuck to the street level. They moved through these streets. And at the time, our enemies were actually light sensitive. So you could say that they were like the creatures in I Am Legend, the film, or you could say they were kind of like mutant vampires, but they didn't really walk around outside, right? So the exterior areas were pretty safe. You're just wandering around. All the gameplay, all the cool stuff was all happening in these interiors, right? And that's where you went and you scavenged for loot, and you'd run into enemy encounters. And at the time, these interiors were, you'd walk around through these exteriors on the streets. You'd wander into these interiors to find loot. And these were just prefabbed environments, so they were placed all over the city. So as you're walking through, you'd see shiny things and go grab them, right? And then get ambushed. And they were things like gas stations and convenience stores and cafes, and they were just all over the city. And so this gameplay was all put in interiors. The other kind of interior we had were these instanced interiors that were mission spaces, right? And this might be a little bit familiar with something like Fallout 3 or Skyrim, which I think was our kind of basis for this, right? You'd go into this dungeon, and that's where the major enemy setups were, and that's where all the cool loot was, and you go grab it all, and you kind of conquer this area, and you come back into the open world with all your new stuff. And that's kind of how the game was structured. Now, I do want to go a little bit into, what about traversal, right? Because Sunset Overdrive, you really can't remove traversal from it and still get Sunset Overdrive. So at this time, we did have a kind of traversal, but it was a very different kind than you'd be familiar with. At the time, the traversal was really slow and deliberate. It was actually completely stolen from a previous game we worked on, Fuse. And all you could really do was you could climb up pipes or ladders, you could shimmy on ledges, you might be able to jump. I mean, you could jump, it wasn't very flexible, right? It was all about being really slow and deliberate with your actions. It was not a platformer. And then remember that our gameplay pillars, like those first two pillars, were scavenging and crafting. So the traversal was all about exploring the spaces, right? Because you were moving through these spaces slowly, and so you could stop and you can look through the nooks and crannies, and you can explore them, and then you could, scavenge for supplies. So what you might see is in the exterior, you might see like a fire escape, right? And then really obvious graffiti that said loot with an arrow. And so maybe you'd climb up there, and that's really what traversal was about. It was not really, it was not associated with combat, right? You couldn't fight and traverse at the same time. If you were in a combat scenario or a combat arena, you were usually just fighting with the enemies on their own turf, or maybe you were traversing onto a different platform so that you had a new vantage point to fight from. But you weren't fighting and moving around the space with a lot of flexibility, because this was not really an agile system. And then the next thing was, traversal also kind of had a puzzle focus. Now, when I say puzzles, I mean that very forgivingly. So here is an example of one of our puzzles that we had, which involved jumping on some crates and then going through a door. These were not very complex puzzles. All they really were about these small traversal sections that sort of linked combat arenas, right? So you'd go into a combat arena space, you'd fight, then you traverse, and then you go to the next space. And so traversal was all about observing the environment and exploring it. Not all of them were super linear like this, right? So in the same mission, this is that big interior mission, with lots of enemies. We might have something that's a little bit more of a playground feel, which might feel a little bit more open world, right? There are a bunch of different ledges that you could climb up on, and you could choose which ones to go on, but your path was mostly the same thing, get to the upper path. So that's what traversal meant in Sunset Overdrive when we first created it. And remember, it was slow and deliberate, it was about exploring, you were scavenging for supplies, and this is really different than that really hyperkinetic, agile system that we ended up shipping with. So the question here is, what happened, right? Well, we had an internal game jam, which I recommend to everyone here. A lot of really cool stuff happened during this game jam, but I'm only going to talk about the traversal one because I don't have much time. And what happened is a couple people went aside and said, well, they said we couldn't put skateboards in this game, but we're going to put skateboards in this game anyway. So they put some skateboards in, some ramps, and trampolines. And skateboards and trampolines, that's pretty much where our new traversal system happened. And what happened was they put this into a road, right? And a bunch of people played, and I'm like, this is really fun. They said, no skateboards, but this is really fun. And what happened was we realized that those exterior areas, remember all our enemies were stuck in interiors? So all the major gameplay were interiors, and these exterior areas were just like, I'm moving from A to B, and it just feels really boring, right? What am I doing? I'm just walking from A to B. And now we had this traversal system. It's like, I'm not walking. I'm riding a skateboard onto a trampoline. Now, at the time, so we kind of owned that, and we adopted that, and we're like, this is fun. We're just going to go with it, right? So we originally kept our old traversal stuff, which involved things like climbing and shimmying, and we don't have those anymore. And crouching as well. And those are kind of like slow movements, right? And then we added on bouncing and grinding and wall runs and pole swings. And we didn't have skateboards. You just grind with your feet. And trampolines turned into cars, and then everything made sense. And we didn't really stop there. We kept going. At the time, we even had jetpacks at one point. We eventually scaled back to a much more manageable collection of traversal moves. But we took ownership over traversal and we said, okay, this is a major pillar in our game. We're making our game with traversal as one of our centerpieces. And what that meant was that it had a huge impact on level design, because suddenly the entire world had a purpose, right? Like all these buildings had a purpose. Basically anything larger than a pizza box could possibly have a traversal aspect associated with it. So when an artist was creating stuff, things that you normally just put in the world as art pieces are now traversal, right? So you have everything from railings to telephone poles and telephone wires to cars to flagpoles. You had air conditioners and fire hydrants and even bushes and trees. Sometimes you could bounce on those. Cars, like the placement of all these things was really important. And you have to remember that in most games, a blank wall is just a blank wall, and you can do whatever you want. You can just give it to an artist, and they can do whatever they want with that blank wall because there's no gameplay there. But in Sunset Overdrive, a blank wall says you can wall run here. It's now part of the player's critical path. So even stuff like where are the blank walls and where did the corner transitions work, all these became really important when it came to the level design of the city. So that was, the rise of traversal had a huge impact on how the city was built, because now the entire city was a playground. So with that said, we finished with Greenlight City, and we cut it, right? We were done with Greenlight City, right? And this is kind of obvious, but I want to go over real quick why change cities at this point. Well, Greenlight was a prototype, which you might have guessed because of the name Greenlight, right? Which is saying we want to get Greenlight by the publisher, so here is what we presented. The next reason, obviously, was we moved from pre-production into production, right? We were done prototyping, or doing the major prototyping, and it was like, okay, we're ready to make a city for real. Next, we got new open world tech. So before this, we had only made linear games, right? Which are like, here's a space, and then an airlock, and another space, and you're just going to go through it. And our tech worked fine for that. And then we told our core engine programmers, oh, we want to make an open world game. Can we do that, please? And so they needed some time to create a system that allowed us to make an open world game. And then that came online around the same time as we were ready to move into production, as the traversal system came online. And then the last thing was, obviously, we solidified the design. With the rise of traversal, we felt we knew what this game was about. We were wrong, which is why this is why there's 3 cities and not 2 cities. But we thought we knew what the game was about, and we thought we had an identity for Sunset Overdrive. And so that brings us to Razor City, which is our second city. So this was our production city. This is the city we were supposed to ship with, and we didn't. So we'll go over a little bit why. But Razor City did a lot of things really successfully, right? So it had a lot of this vertical movement. There's a lot of layers. The player could take any of these ledges and grab them and vault straight up. If they fell off of something, there was something for them to land on and then usually bounce back up again. It had a lot of use of this vertical space that, remember, in Greenlight, you had very little of that vertical space. We also had these huge outdoor areas with long grind rails that just crisscross the environment and let the player kind of ride it like a roller coaster. So not only were you climbing up and down, but you were riding things like roller coasters, and all of this together really felt a lot like the Sunset City and the Sunset Overdrive you might be familiar with, right? Like, this is what we ended up making anyway. So, the question there is, what happened to Razor City? We got rid of it a few months into development, but why? What went wrong? It was going so well. Well, the first thing that went wrong was we still had interiors, right? And this is why I went through Greenlight first. So interior spaces. So this is the clothing store, which is the largest interior space we had. I guess it was supposed to be like a mall store. And it still was full of loot. But now you had a new traversal system where you were moving at 24 miles per hour and into a wall. And there was just no way we could create a traversal system or integrate a traversal system into these interiors that you're supposed to seamlessly walk in and out of. You couldn't put a bouncy in here. Sorry, bouncy is the proper term for a thing that you bounce on. It's a bouncy. So you couldn't put a bouncy on here. You couldn't put grind rails in here. You couldn't let the player move around because they would start moving and then they would just keep hitting the walls. They would just feel really claustrophobic and trapped in these areas. So what happened was we had a few of these in, we played with them, we said, oh, that's really bad, so we just stopped putting them in. We didn't actually remove them, we just stopped putting them into Razor City because we kind of realized that was a bad idea. But we also had other interiors, right? Remember I said that we had interior mission spaces that were kind of like dungeons, right? These are major mission events in these spaces. Now these spaces were instanced, right? You go into a door, the open world would unload, this interior space would load in, and that meant that the mission designers could make them any size they wanted. So in gameplay, they actually felt really good. You could run around this interior space because it was built to our traversal metrics. You weren't running into walls. It was just a really cool space, and that was okay, except for the fact that, that meant the spaces on the interiors were kind of bigger than the exteriors. So this is one of like 12 rooms of the hot dog factory. But you didn't really notice that the hot dog factory was bigger on the inside than the outside, because the exterior was actually this giant, massive building on the corner of the world in this industrial park. So people were like, yeah, sure, it doesn't make sense, but no one notices, right? That's not true for all the spaces, right? So we also had another mission that we were prototyping in the interior, was the radio station mission. And forgive me, but it's really hard to get a good picture of this area. But these are 2 of the 4 courtyards in this space, and it's just a really massive interior space. And again, it felt good to move around, to fight in it. It was a good 20-minute gameplay experience inside this interior space. And the mission designer was going in, and I'm like, yeah, I'm making a really awesome space. And the open world designers were making a really tiny space on the outside, because what they were worried about was that there was this radio tower that was in the center of the city, and it had to fit within an open world, right? Player needed to be able to move around it and over it, and it just had to fit within the city. And if you made that the same size as the interior, well, now you basically have a building that's about 12 times the size it needs to be. And you could fit several of those exterior buildings inside of the interior. And since it was in the middle of the city, you couldn't hide it anymore, right? It was a comical mismatch. And so we decided we have to cut those. We have to cut interiors completely. We have to put everything in the open world. The next problem that we ran into, I'm running out of time soon. So the next problem we ran into was linear spaces. So this is kind of a tradition because we've made a lot of linear games in the past. This is the first time we made open world games. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with linear spaces. It might work for some games. I will say just it does not work for ours. And this is some of the problems we ran into. Let's go back to that hot dog factory mission, the one that I said was this big industrial building. Well, this is kind of what it looked like. And it was this big linear space. You have a combat arena, and you had this really cool long traversal thing in a hot dog factory, because that's what you do. And then another combat space. And the problem here is if you look at this picture, it doesn't say anything about this being an open world game, right? This is something that fit more into a Ratchet and Clank, right? You're moving through a game in a platformer game in a linear direction. This is not open world, I don't see anything open world about this. And then, of course, it also meant we had huge interior spaces. And once we did cut interiors, we also had exterior missions that we tried to integrate into the world. So this is the barbecue mission area. You start at the bottom, and you climb on your way up to the top. And again, we were creating this really linear gameplay. And so in this case, it was this platforming puzzle. But you had to go up it a very specific way. And that really didn't take advantage. Again, this doesn't feel like an open world environment, right? The space doesn't say that it's open world. It's a linear space, not a non-linear space. So again, we decided to cut this sort of linear gameplay that we were creating in our mission spaces. But we were creating these spaces in Razor City, and that was one of the problems. The next thing I want to point out are mission dead zones. I don't know how many other games really run into this problem, but let's look back at that barbecue mission, right? This is an exterior mission space. You were supposed to solve it or go through it in a very specific way at a very specific time. And so what that meant was that this space needed to be off limits to the player during regular gameplay, right? If they're just wandering around the city. Now that might work in some games, but in ours, where your traversal moves were so, flexible, and I'll just say you could just exploit them to get onto anything and anywhere. what was happening is that in order to actually preserve this space and preserve the integrity of a linear puzzle environment, is we had to strip everything that had traversal mechanics off the side of the walls. The walls had to be covered in spikes and barbed wire. Otherwise, you could wall run and then jump, and then you're on top of something, right? You couldn't have dumpsters next to the walls because you could bounce on the dumpsters. There's all kinds of restrictions, and so you're moving from one side of the city to the other, and then all of a sudden you hit this spot, and it's like, well, now I've stopped my momentum. You know, I don't have any grind rails. I don't have anything to bounce. I can't get up. I can't move around. And this is a problem with how fluidly we wanted to move through the game and how we wanted to make this fully integrated city. And this was definitely an example of a space that, again, didn't feel like it was integrated into an open world city. So we kind of made the decision that all of our spaces had to be open world spaces. They had to be integrated into the city. We had to allow the player to go anywhere at any time they wanted. Now, our missions could still be linear. You could still do objective 1, and then objective 2, and then objective 3, and so on and so forth. But when it came to actually moving through the city, those objectives could be in a particular space, but that space had to be nonlinear, right? We had to accept that the player could move through it in multiple ways. And that was more about making sure that that open world feel was sort of just felt good, right? Moving through the city, especially at the speed at which we moved, and you could keep that momentum up. And then the last thing, and it's not a minor one, that happened with Razor City, that was a problem, was that everyone was messing with geometry. So what kind of happened is we started production. We got a bunch of people on the team, and it was like, okay, we know what our game is. We got the tools for it. Everybody ready, get set, go. Make the world. And we had, a basic white box, but what ended up happening is that everyone had different things that they were trying to accomplish in the game, right? Everyone had their own sub-goals as well as making the game. And we kind of carved out our own little fiefdoms in this big Razor City. So when I say who created geometry, what I'm talking about is we had our world builders who were mostly focused on traversal, right? They were our traversal system designers. And they were worried about these open world traversal paths. Then we had environment artists, and they were looking at landmarks and horizon lines and creating realistic buildings. We had to understand, realistic buildings can be really cool, and they can be really awful for traversal, because there's all kinds of things you get caught up on. Like I said, anything bigger than a pizza box can cause problems. So environment artists were making really cool buildings, but then we were running into all kinds of traversal problems. Meanwhile, our world builders were making really cool traversal playgrounds, and the artists were looking at them and being, what is this monstrosity you built? So there were a lot of disconnect going on there. And then you also had mission designers who were taking those spaces like that barbecue factory I mentioned, and they were like, okay, well, this is my mission landmark. I'm going to carve out my own little spot and redesign the geometry for my purposes. And then combat designers were prototyping combat in their little combat arenas in little places around the city. And then multiplayer designers were trying to worry about 8 players in a single space. And so everybody was kind of, their fingers were all in the pie, right? And so what ended up happening was instead of dealing with conflicts before they happened, we would build stuff and then the conflicts would rise. And that was causing a lot of problems for geometry. And then the last thing I want to point out is baggage, right? So what went wrong with Razor City? And this is referring to baggage from Greenlight, right? Because we still had scavenging, right? Crafting was still a major component. We took on traversal, but we didn't get rid of those linear spaces, those interiors. There's a lot of things that we still dragged in from Greenlight that no longer suited Sunset Overdrive in the game it was. And we needed to let go of that. So we took Razor City a few months into development, and we cut it. We started again from scratch, which is a little bit of a scary proposition, but it ended up working really well for us. But yeah, so we started from scratch. We created a workflow with a hierarchy that made sense. And so let's go over Sunset City really quick. So I want to talk about what we did right with Sunset City. Because I talked about all the things we did wrong. And there's some things we did wrong with Sunset City, but we mostly did things that were right. And the first thing we did was we decided what kind of open world game we were. And when I'm saying like what kind of open world game, you know, there's really a continuum between linear and open world. It's really not you flip a switch and you're one or the other. And I would put Sunset Overdrive almost, not all the way, but almost at the end of the open world spectrum. And as if you were here this morning for the Firewatch discussion, right, they might be somewhere in the middle, right, because they have these open world areas, and then they unlock the next area, and then they unlock the next area. And so there's a continuum here, but with Sunset, we decided we were on the end of open world. We were going to have all nonlinear spaces, all spaces that would had reuse, no spaces that were locked off, and we took ownership over that, and we went with that, and that was kind of like the rule of the law of design. Oh, I ran out of time. And then there's some more slides. Done. This is the Sunset City we shipped with. I knew I was going to run out of time. Thank you.